ceasefire, a word that should mean relief, but in the Russia-Ukraine war, it could be a dangerous illusion. Instead, it is Russia waiting to regroup, rearm, and reattack beyond Ukraine. If Europe allows Moscow to claim even a sliver of Ukrainian territory, it may send a green light for further aggression toward the Baltic states or other NATO neighbors. And European countries are now investing heavily in defense, not just to protect Ukraine, but to prepare for the wider war. The question now isn't whether the ceasefire will hold, but how much damage it could enable before the next war even begins. On August 18, 2025, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky sat down with Donald Trump and a room full of European leaders to discuss what a ceasefire might look like. It was billed as a breakthrough, but it exposed the chaos, contradictions, and political games surrounding the war in Ukraine, one where Ukraine risks losing everything. Let's start with the facts. Trump met the war criminal, Putin, in Alaska just days before this summit. In it, Putin flat out rejected a ceasefire. Instead, he demanded Ukraine give up territory in the east in exchange for a so-called freeze. Translation? Russia keeps its land grab, and Ukraine gets vague promises of protection. According to open-source estimates, Russia already controls about 20% of Ukraine. That's 1/5 of the country. Putin wants Ukraine to cut its losses. And disturbingly, Trump seemed ready to agree. At the White House, things looked different on the surface. Trump and Zelensky smiled for the cameras, but behind the warm photos, the talks revealed deep fractures. European leaders pushed hard for a ceasefire before any peace deal. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said bluntly he couldn't imagine more talks without one. French President Emmanuel Macron said Europe may even need boots on the ground to secure peace. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte warned that stopping the killing must be the priority. Yet Trump shrugged it off, saying a ceasefire wasn't needed. "You can work on a peace deal while they're fighting," he told reporters. Let that sink in. Europe wants the bloodshed to stop. Trump says it can continue while the paperwork gets sorted. And then there's the issue of security guarantees. Trump promised the US would back Europe in protecting Ukraine. Zelensky hailed that as a major step forward and even offered to buy $90 billion worth of US weapons. But the details are completely vague, and Europeans don't really trust Trump's promises. Still, they play along in front of the cameras. Russia's foreign ministry quickly reminded the world that it rejects NATO troops in Ukraine. So what kind of guarantee are we talking about? Another Minsk deal? Another Budapest memorandum? Those agreements gave Ukraine assurances in the past, and we all saw how worthless they were when Russia invaded in 2022, and even in 2014. Here's the real controversy. Trump has signaled he wants a trilateral meeting with Putin and Zelensky, but history shows what that means. Zelensky cornered, with Trump and Putin pressuring him to cut a deal that could mean giving up the Donbass, maybe Crimea, maybe more. Putin has always called Zelensky illegitimate. If such a meeting happens, it's easy to imagine Trump and Putin ganging up and telling Ukraine to surrender land or lose US support. So, where do talks stand today? In truth, nowhere is stable. Europe demands a ceasefire. Trump dismisses it. Ukraine begs for real guarantees. Russia offers only scraps. And the war continues, already costing over 1 million casualties, including thousands of Ukrainian civilians. This so-called diplomatic moment is less about peace and more about power politics. Ukraine is at risk of trading land for empty promises. One might ask why, because such a ceasefire has already happened with the country, only to end up with another surprise attack. Ceasefires are often sold to the public as a step toward peace, but history shows they can just be reload breaks that prepare the ground for an even bigger war. Take the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015. Both were pushed as solutions after Russia first grabbed Crimea and parts of Donbass. For a while, the fighting slowed down, but the Kremlin used it to reorganize, test new weapons, and build defenses. The result was shown in February 2022 when Moscow launched a full-scale invasion. This proves that those peace deals were never real peace at all. Analysts now warn that the same trap could repeat itself if a new ceasefire is signed. The battlefield itself shows why. Russia has not slowed its attacks, even during peace talks. On August 18th to 19th, 2025, while negotiations were taking place in Washington, Moscow fired around 270 drones and 10 missiles at 16 Ukrainian locations, targeting critical infrastructure like the Kremenchuk refinery in Poltava. That's not the behavior of a government preparing for lasting peace, but the behavior of a state buying time to hit harder later. While politicians argue about peace talks, the reality on the ground is different. Entire generations are being wiped out, both Russian and Ukrainian. This war has been catastrophic. The first year alone killed more Russians than Afghanistan and Chechnya combined. Wagner Group's chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, admitted his mercenaries lost 20,000 men in just a few months. Words like strategy and territory sound empty compared to this reality. The real story is of destroyed families, shattered cities, and endless graves. And the tragedy does not stop with Russia and Ukraine. It is beginning to spread across a whole continent. 2025 could be the last summer of peace in Europe. Why? Because dangers are growing fast. German military historian Professor Sönke Neitzel warns that Russia could attack Europe as early as this fall. The risk is not only in Ukraine. If Europe allows Russia to claim parts of Ukraine under a ceasefire, Russia might target the Baltic states. Belarus could also be used as a decoy. Neitzel is not alone. Ukrainian President Zelensky and top generals point to joint Russian-Belarusian exercises, Zapad 2025, as a cover to move offensive forces. These exercises involve over 13,000 troops and could rehearse attacks against NATO countries. Russia has already strengthened its military along Finland's and Norway's borders. It built a new army headquarters in Petrozavodsk to control tens of thousands of troops. Weapons production and recruitment are rising too. Russia's military budget may reach $137 billion in 2025, over 6% of GDP. Its army could grow to 1.5 million troops, with 30 to 50% more equipment near NATO borders. Europe is scrambling. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Germany's Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, and others warn that full preparation could take years. They estimate Russia could be ready for large-scale war by 2029 or 2030. Germany is finally increasing defense spending. Other European nations are also speeding up militarization. Still, the gap with Russia remains large. By some measures, Russia spends as much on its military as all of Europe combined. In 2024, Russia spent $461.6 billion, while Europe spent $457 billion, adjusted for purchasing power. Not everyone agrees. Some analysts, like those at the Quincy Institute, say Russia lacks the capacity or reason to attack NATO. Putin denies plans beyond Ukraine. Yet European leaders cannot ignore the warning signs. Sabotage and subversive acts in Europe almost tripled from 2023 to 2024. Attacks on undersea cables, critical infrastructure, and troop movements in Belarus show preparations for something bigger. If the West miscalculates, Europe could face a new war. The last summer of carefree, sun-soaked streets may already be gone. But all this preparation depends on one thing: the ceasefire. When people hear the word ceasefire, they usually think of peace. But history paints a different picture. Ceasefires are often the most dangerous phase of war. Research shows that 31% of interstate wars end in stalemates under ceasefire deals, leaving the main problem unresolved. Even worse, most ceasefires collapse quickly. Minor violations appear within 10 days, and major breakdowns happen between 65 and 193 days. Russia itself has violated at least 25 ceasefire agreements since 2014. The Minsk I and Minsk II agreements prove the point. Both failed because Moscow used them not to create peace, but to regroup and prepare for more attacks. So, what would a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine include? The first issue is territory. Russia controls about 20% of Ukraine's land, including Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. Reports say Putin once pushed Trump to freeze the front line and accept this occupation as permanent. But President Zelensky has already made it clear any concession would require a national referendum. After more than 1 million people have been killed or wounded, it's unimaginable that Ukrainians would vote to surrender their homes. Still, Trump has argued that Russia is strong, Ukraine is weak, and may pressure Kyiv to sacrifice. That's the first fault line. The second issue is security. Trump floated the idea of giving Ukraine something similar to NATO's Article 5. But without real NATO membership, such promises would remain vague, much like the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that Russia broke in 2014. A lasting ceasefire would need much more than promises. The UK, along with France and other nations, is ready to help Ukraine with air and sea support, including RAF jets flying over western Ukraine and British naval ships in the region. They also plan to put troops on the ground if needed and provide military aid and training to strengthen Ukraine's army. Without this kind of real support, Russia could keep attacking with missiles, drones, and cyber attacks, while claiming to honor the ceasefire. That's the second fault line. The third issue is humanitarian. Europe demands that kidnapped Ukrainian children and prisoners be returned. But history shows Putin drags out such negotiations for years, using hostages as bargaining chips. This ceasefire could also give Russia valuable time to rearm, unless sanctions remain tied directly to Moscow's behavior. So, where does this ceasefire really stand? For Europe, it's about stopping the bloodshed and protecting millions of lives. For Trump, it's a deal to showcase influence. For Putin, it's a calculated pause, an opportunity to weaken Ukraine, divide Europe, and probe Western resolve. That's the real danger. Trump says negotiations can happen while they're fighting. But how can talks succeed when bombs are still falling, cities are burning, and civilians are dying? When world leaders talk about peace like this, one truth becomes clear. Someone is using the ceasefire not to end the war, but to prepare the next strike. The real question now is for Europe. Are European nations ready to fight if a ceasefire fails? Can the EU prepare its weapons and defenses before Moscow strikes again? Or will Europe be caught off guard while the war quietly recharges? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more deep dives into global geopolitics.